Hi, BookTube. Welcome to another fiction review. I dug out my spoiler alert slide. I could not work out how to review this book properly without giving away, I was going to say plot details, but that's not the right word, because this novel gives the reader plenty of signals that I think anyone would interpret as plot points. But the book seems blithely unaware or unconcerned, perhaps, about those reader expectations, and so I don't know to what degree we can speak of plot at all. Today we are reviewing The Radiant Way by Margaret Drabble, published in 1987, 396 pages, and today's review is brought to you by the letter D. This is one of my alphabet soup TBR books. Why? To get it read. To get it read. I have owned it for I really don't know how long. I'm going to say 30 years minimum. I'm very sure it was a purchase from Hay on Wye in the 1990s, when we used to attend the Hay Festival every year, and we stuffed the trunk of our car with secondhand books that we both bought on impulse. My edition was a Penguin pocketbook. It was so fashionable in the 70s and 80s to have those small books, but small books have small single-spaced font. I'm going to show you to the camera now. Yeah, very tight text on the pages. The cover on my copy calls this novel powerful. That's not the word I would choose. The words that came to mind for me: subtle, gentle, and gently surprising. You'll note too, from the Amazon prices, that it's very difficult to get a hold of this book in the US, much easier to get secondhand, cheap copies in the UK, and we're going to talk about that when we go to the section on structure. First, we'll meet the author, Margaret Drabble, or as she is presently known, Dame Margaret Drabble, Lady Holroyd. She was born in 1939 in Sheffield. Her father was the barrister and novelist John Frederick Drabble, and her sister is the well-known author A.S. Byatt. She went to the Mount School in York. That's a Quaker school. Her father's family were Quakers. And then she went on to Newnham College, Cambridge, studied English literature. Her first published novel was The Summer Birdcage in 1963. Before that, she had spent a few years trying her hand on the stage, working for the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford. She's also known for doing a great deal of non-fiction, either as an editor or as an author. She has several literary biographies and works of history published. And a few weeks ago, Margaret Drabble would have celebrated her 87th birthday. Let's talk about structure, starting with the setting as a place, and this is why it's so difficult to get a hold of the book in the US. Really, this book is so much a part of its setting. It's so much England in the 1980s, and I can see why it wouldn't sell particularly well in the United States. I don't know if people would get the issues necessarily or identify with the characters' particular problems. Mainly we're in London, right? And that's a real place. I have to say that. You'll find out why. We also spend a sizable amount of time in a city called Northam. And the narrator calls Northam the figurative northern city. And I misunderstood the meaning of the word figurative. I thought the narrator meant that if you surveyed all northern English cities and got a list of their common characteristics, you would find that Northam had all of these. And yet, the jobs that I've had since I moved to the UK in 1986, so that's some time ago, they've all really forced me to become very familiar with English geography. So I had not heard of Northam, and I thought, wait a minute, that's odd. I would have heard about it if it was a city of any size. So, of course, I checked Google Maps, and Google Maps informed me that the only Northam there is in the UK is located in Devon, down in the southwest. Okay, so one city is fictional. And I don't know, the only reason I'm talking about it is that all the other locations in the book are real. They're based on real places. And she does devote a lot of time to detailing surroundings. So I thought it was interesting that this fictional city was also very detailed. And I thought, why don't you just call it... I don't know is the answer. That was one of the gentle surprises in this novel. Time. Again, this is a realistic novel in the sense that it really grounds you in time. The first chapter just pins us to the calendar. It is New Year's Eve, 1979, in London. And the last chapter pins us down. On page 394, the final scene, there's a date at the very end of the text, June 1985. In the UK, these are interesting years, right? Margaret Thatcher becomes Prime Minister in 1979, and there's the first privatizations of public-owned companies like British Aerospace in 1981. The invasion of the Falkland Islands happens in 1982, and UK unemployment numbers reach record levels that haven't been known since the 1930s, all in that period of time. There was the miners' strike as well in 1984. It is a time when people are taking sides and drawing hard lines. And I can remember myself arriving in the UK in 1986 and knowing that work colleagues were having these really bad-tempered arguments about government decisions. And I just, and I was still finding my way trying to figure out what's going on here. What's all the anger about? And this is the sort of setting which I feel you could use to make a very dramatic, sweeping kind of novel with the characters on the front lines, so to speak, making decisions in Parliament or being the ones affected by those decisions. A soldier coming back wounded, maybe from the Falklands, a miner unable to find new employment. There is scope for no-holds-barred realism that's really hard-hitting. And The Radiant Way just isn't that kind of novel. The characters in The Radiant Way, they aren't greatly affected by what happens during these years. Even the ones who are affected, I would say they don't face great danger or great economic hardship. Not really. If I can lapse into sideline mode for just a moment and be more subjective, this aspect of the novel puzzled me the most. Why set your novel in this place and time, one that is remembered for all its big societal changes, and tell the story of characters who are really very little touched by these events, although they're aware of them and they do talk about them, they do worry about them a bit. And it's true that the characters do have their own issues quite apart from what's going on in the world, but in a way, the novel is a little Jane Austen-like in the sense that, remember with Pride and Prejudice, the background to it historically is the Napoleonic Wars, but you would be hard-pressed. You really have to look for intertextual clues and know your history to realize that kind of an event is going on in the background of Pride and Prejudice. The focus in Jane Austen's novels is very much her heroines and their immediate domestic life. And The Radiant Way is very similar. The characters, yes, they know the events that are around them. They have televisions. They can read all the newspapers. They know what's going on. And they argue about current events, sometimes passionately. But the bottom line is that their lives are not greatly changed by these events, or any events for that matter. The narrative viewpoint is third-person omniscient, and I mean, what else would you use for a postmodern novel? How else are you going to convey all that self-consciousness of the fact that this is a fictional construct if the narrator isn't a 100% can go anywhere in space and time? And the narrative voice is interested in detail, whether that is external, like descriptions of decor, personal possessions, or dialogue, or whether it is those repeating thoughts that an ordinary person has when they're looking back on their life and they're questioning whether what they did was good or bad and what should they do now. The narrator chooses to devote most of their time to three female characters: Liz Headland, Alex Bowen, and Esther Breuer. These three women they're about the same age, and the significant thing about them is that they probably would never have met and never have become friends if they had been born at a different time in English history. Their backgrounds are too different, and they never lived close as children. By chance, all three of them are accepted into the same college at Cambridge in the mid-60s, and that was one of those times when social mobility was easier. And in this case, that's because the women are more emancipated and university fees are paid for by the government. And it meant that academically inclined working-class girls could discover and challenge their ability and be rewarded for it, and also meet people that came from a completely different social class background. Let's talk about narrative style, because I recognized that there was literary pastiche going on right at the beginning of the book. It starts with Liz getting ready for the New Year's Eve party that she is hosting. The sentence construction and the fluid way that the viewpoint was switching around as guests arrived and the party all got going, all this was giving me déjà vu. I was constantly reminded of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which makes sense. Mrs. Dalloway is also a well-to-do woman who's planning a party, and the narration is, yes, following her, but it also strays away from her to notice all the people around her. And in doing so, you get kind of a portrait of the place at the time, of London at the time. And similarly, in Liz's party, the reader is behaving kind of like a telepathic ghost. They're just flitting all around the room, eavesdropping on conversations and thoughts, but always returning here and there to the hostess to see how she's getting on, how she's reacting. And I noticed a second pastiche on page 84. It's just a passing mention of Jane Austen by Esther, but then in the very next paragraph, we shift writing style dramatically. Like, I really noticed it. And the sentences, suddenly they acquire those multiple clauses, and the choice of words, it's not Regency precisely, but there's no vocabulary in those sentences which would have been out of place in an Austen novel. Let me read you some extracts from page 1 and page 84 so you can hear the difference. Actually changed my mind. I'm going to start reading from page 25 because I think that shows you the party in full swing. By 10:30, Deirdre Malloy Kavanagh had parted with all her little triangles of tri-coloured pastry, taken off her apron, drunk a few glasses of champagne, told several guests that broccoli was out of fashion, and was busily engaged in conversation with a television journalist who had just returned from making a program for Charles in Iran. He was telling her about the Ayatollah, and she was telling him about her convent days. Their words fluttered between them like lubricious little doves. At Deirdre's elbow stood the faithless Jonathan Headland, who was trying to explain to his stepmother's first husband, Edgar, why he decided, after all his protest, to follow in his father's footsteps, while simultaneously trying to keep one eye on Deirdre, for whom he felt responsible, and on the other on his girlfriend Kate Williams, who was being harangued by a Tory backbencher about Marxist infiltration of the Open University. The Open University was also the subject of debate between Alex Bowen and Teddy Lazenby of the Department of Education and Science. Alex's face was expressing a most delicate mixture of disbelief, disapprobation, and polite attention as Teddy, somewhat indiscreetly presuming on their long, if long, interrupted acquaintance, revealed what were clearly his own opinions on the inadvisability of wasting money on the education of housewives and taxi drivers. In other corners and other rooms, dozens of other topics floated gaily on the lively, slightly choppy waters, their pennants bobbing and fluttering in the end of year, the terminal breeze, the approaching steel strike, the brave new era of threatened privatization, the abuse of North Sea oil resources, the situation in Afghanistan, the Annan report, the prospect of a fourth television channel, the viability of Charles' attempt to conquer the United States, the Cambridge Apostles, the disarray of the Labour Party, the deplorable vogue for Buck's Fizz as a party drink, the Yorkshire Ripper, the Harrow Road murderer, the Prince of Wales. In a doorway, wedged between a Guardian leader writer and a Kleinian analyst, Alex Headland and his ex-tutor, Otto Werner from the LSE, were debating with a fine abstraction and a noble disregard of interruption the question as to whether or not a television program was a primary product or a service, and whether, by implication or extension, Charles's production company, Global Information Networks, Telex GIN, was allied in ideological terms with the manufacturing or the service industries. With equal commitment, Esther Breuer and Jules Griffin, colleague of Liz Headland, were discussing the nature of ancestral voices in schizophrenic patients, and in the Homeric and biblical epic, and the portrayal of the Holy Ghost in Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. And this is the Jane Austen section from page 84. Esther, Liz, and Alex, who in Jane Austen's day would never have met at all, met in Cambridge in 1952, just before Christmas, when they were up for interview from their respective schools. Alex was applying to read English literature, Liz to read natural sciences with a view to medicine, and Esther to read modern languages. This should have safely prevented any rapport between them, but did not. There were, it is true, many awkwardnesses in their first communications, for none of them was much used to speaking to strangers, but this lack of patience was balanced by a strong desire on the part of all three of them to enter upon a new life in which speaking to strangers was possible. Otherwise, each had separately recognized the future was circumscribed, somehow, haltingly, over dinner in hall, chicken, leeks, and tinned spaghetti, a mixture delicious to each after years of post-war whale meat and school meals. They lurched into conversation, having found themselves for no good reason sitting together. Liz and Alex discovered that both came from Yorkshire, and that neither played lacrosse, nor had ever seen it being played, and Esther joined the discussion by volunteering that she had herself managed to avoid playing netball for the past 3 years, on the grounds that she was too small. Regarding the number of characters, I am going to register a protest. You may have felt it as you were listening to that section talking about the party, but the number of characters introduced in Chapter 1, I counted them. The chapter is 47 pages long, and you meet nearly 40 people in those 47 pages. And it's just, okay, only a few of them you ever meet again, but you don't know that when you're at the beginning of the book. And so the effect, yes, it's good in the sense that when you go to a party that size, that is how you would feel, just overwhelmed by the number of people, only remembering a few names, feeling a bit lost, yes. But I had to decide by the end of Chapter 1 not to worry about the fact that I really didn't remember anyone. Regarding mobility, yeah, the characters do move around. Some move further than others. I couldn't say, though, that it's particularly meaningful, but as we'll talk about in The Rabbit Hole, this is a postmodern work, and so the very idea of anything being meaningful is just not the nature of this beast. And I also want to say about representation, this is a book about middle-class English white people. As I was reading Margaret Drabble's Wikipedia page, I got the impression that her books tended to stay very close to what she knew and what she'd lived, and sometimes included autobiographical details. Her female protagonists, I am told, they got older as she got older. Now, regarding Margaret herself, I think I should share something that I learned literally after I'd written this script. Yesterday, I was reading a new nonfiction book, which I'll hold up to camera. It is Walking Away by Simon Armitage. He is, I believe he still is, the English Poet Laureate. And this is his book about walking the Southwest Coast Path. And he stops to visit Margaret Drabble on his way during the walk. And I was so surprised. I sat back and thought, my goodness, I've just finished reading my very first Margaret Drabble. And now here she is being mentioned in another book. But what Simon Armitage mentions is that Margaret Drabble offered Salman Rushdie her home. This was back in the 1980s when he was first threatened by the fatwa. She offered him her home as a place of sanctuary and safety, and he took her up on the offer. And apparently a few days later, he turned up on her doorstep along with a number of Secret Service men. And he did stay there. I don't know how long, the book doesn't say, but I thought that was an interesting aspect of her biography that you don't see online. Problematic content? Not really. Not really. I mean, there is one unhappy scene where Alex, because she works with female prisoners, she finds out what has happened to a former inmate. And yes, that is tragic. But it does kind of, that incident makes it clear how the anxieties and the troubles of the main characters themselves, really, they don't amount to much. I think the most dramatic thing actually happens to minor characters in this book. And there are a couple of sex scenes. The couples are married, though not necessarily to each other in one case, but there isn't a great amount of detail to them, and to be honest, I found them quite forgettable. For my rabbit hole, I'd like to explain why, on my statistics slide, I refer to this novel as postmodern light. And what on earth do I mean by that? I can only explain that by referring to another postmodern novel, to Maggie G's Dying in Other Words. Now, everything about the outside of dying, in other words, makes you think you're getting a murder mystery, a police procedural perhaps, and also there are hints of the Gothic. It was quite exciting. But a few pages into the first chapter, and you get the text challenging those expectations, and I mean strongly challenging them, so that really by the end of chapter 1, I knew that I had to adjust my expectations before I carried on reading. The Radiant Way reads differently. I mean, disregarding the fact that it does open a little bit Virginia Woolf-like, but that made sense because it's a big party, and you get the greatest advantage as a reader by being allowed to slip around, not needing to worry yourself about the constraints of time or space or other people's minds and access to them. And so you know more about that party than any of the guests did or the hosts. And then when the Jane Austen bit kicked in on page 84 and it talked about Liz and Alex and Esther and how they met, I thought, okay, my expectations then were set up to think, okay, this story is about these three women and significant things are going to happen to them. And then they don't. Not really. I'll use Liz Headland as an example. The party is the time and the place where Liz finds out, and she finds out from her party guests, that her husband is planning to divorce her and marry one of the other party guests, a minor aristocrat named Lady Harriet. And you think, wow, that's the kind of fictional opening that could set you up for a really dramatic novel, that you'll have all the acrimony between the two partners, that the children, will they or won't they get involved? And then, of course, what will the media do? Because Liz and Charles, they're the kind of people that the newspapers would be interested in writing about. And then you think, okay, so fine, we get to, what about Liz herself? Where's she going to live? What about the children? Will she stay in touch with them? Some of them aren't hers, they're Charles from another marriage. So, what will her relationship with them be like? And then, is she going to try another relationship herself? And then what about her friends? Are they going to support her? Will Alex and Esther be on her side or sympathize more with Charles? Because they do kind of envy Liz a little bit. So you think, oh, okay, there's that. And then what about Charles and Lady Harriet? Is that a good choice? Is that relationship going to work? You think that there's just going to be so much drama. And yet, what actually happens is kind of underwhelming. There's no real conflict between Liz and Charles. Just one sort of bit of emotion, and then it's all kind of done. Liz moves house, and she's quite wealthy in her own right, so it's a lovely house with a lovely garden. She can have people over. She does go out to dinner with a couple of men that she's either introduced to or she meets as a result of her work, and that's it. She goes to dinner with them. Nothing else happens. But there is a mystery in Liz Headland's life. Her mother will never talk to Liz about Liz's father. Liz has no idea who he was. And at some point in the novel, you get this description of a physical object in Liz's mother's house. And it's a very detailed description of this object because Liz knows it well. And then a little further on, you suddenly get a hint in the text that makes you think, aha, wait a second, that object that was so carefully described about 40 pages ago, that object somehow belongs in Lady Harriet's family. And yet Liz's mother owns it. Why? And never talks about what it is. And you think, oh my goodness, what if there's some kind of familial connection between Lady Harriet and Liz? And so I spent the rest of the book thinking, oh, we're probably going to have that surprise. Liz is going to put two and two together. She's going to have the object and then someone telling her how it's connected to Lady Harriet, and there's going to be this breakthrough, and it's going to be a big plot point and change things. And no, she never finds out. She never finds out. The book ends and she's no wiser. The object is still there, but nobody knows its significance. She still doesn't know who her father is. And with Alex and Esther, again, there's no real hint of jeopardy or drama in their lives, except for that moment when Alex finds out about a former inmate. That is very sad. But again, Alex, I think the worst is she's afraid of losing her job, although when she does, isn't a big deal. Esther is friends with an Italian man, and he's becoming obsessed with the occult in a way that is concerning. People are worried about his mental stability. And again, my expectation here was, we're going to get some drama. We're going to get some drama. No drama. None whatsoever. You know, as I say, Alex loses her job, so does her husband. They move back up north because he's from Northam, and they get settled down there, and Alex doesn't need to work because property is cheaper. And so she does some volunteering, and she likes it. And Esther's Italian professor, who's looking like he's dangerously on the verge of losing his grip on reality, he has a stroke and he dies. And Esther goes and lives in Italy with the man's sister. That's it. And I suppose the ending as well of this book, it just, none of these little expectations were being fulfilled or leading to anything in a way. It was as if Margaret Drabble had they just appeared randomly. All these things were just random, totally random. They weren't structured to lead to anything. And then I got to the end of the book, which was very weird, because essentially the three women got together for a little holiday in Somerset, a property that Esther acquired from a friend of a friend, and they stayed there for 2 weeks, and they went hiking in the hills, and it was lovely, and it was sunny. End of novel. So it definitely postmodern, in that no matter what expectations I decided to bring or what drama I anticipated, no matter how I read the clues in the book, I was wrong, always wrong. So where am I going with all this? Well, The Radiant Way, I think, is a light form of postmodernism, because Margaret Drabble always allows you to keep up your expectations that there will be a plot structure, that there will be this dramatic sort of climax and denouement and all that. And really, until the last few pages, you have the luxury of being able to continue with those expectations. And then even when she lets you down and you realize, oh no, it's just kind of a very gentle trailing off as the ladies walk across the grassy hills of Somerset. You don't feel that you're let down exactly, because in many ways the novel contained many things that you did expect to find in a novel, and yet just not put together the way you would expect. It was like being told a long, detailed joke that has a very weird, nonsensical punchline. So the writing was enjoyable. I was engaged and interested in the characters always, but their stories were just not structured in a way that I was used to when novels are structured. That's it. And that's the review done. Now, for Middlemarch Meditation viewers, you must be thinking, hey, hang on, the schedule was for a Middlemarch meditation this weekend. It was, wasn't it? And I was writing this script and the Middlemarch meditation at the same time, and I don't know why, but my brain just said, yeah, I'm more interested, I have more thoughts, and it was spilling those thoughts out, and I had to type them up. And before I knew it, Margaret Drabble's script, the review, was ready, and I thought, well, I might as well film it and finish Middlemarch, because there's still enough of June that we can finish Middlemarch, both meditations, before the end of the month. So that's what I'm going to do. In the meantime, everybody, I hope you're having really good reading, and I will see you again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.